Okay, I'm so glad you guys are with us this morning. I invite you to turn in your Bibles to 2 Kings chapter 17. 2 Kings chapter 17. We're going to continue in our series about faith in faithlessness. We're looking at a time in God's Word in the nation of Israel and in Judah where some people chose to live by faith in God and others chose a life of faithlessness. And by choosing that, you see the decisions and you see the consequences that happen. And as we're going through this series and we're looking at these different things, what you want to be asking yourself is, how do I act like some of the people here in these descriptions and what happened all those years ago? So I invite you to turn in your Bibles to 2 Kings chapter 17. All right, so who knows what today is? Today's date. Are we still October? No, we are in November. So for some of you holiday people, November gets to you change the calendar over and some things are different, and we kind of get into this season of thankfulness, right? And then we step into the season of giving because we've got Thanksgiving coming at the end of the month. And I love this time of year. I love Thanksgiving and Christmas. I love Christmas music. I already started playing some last week. Larissa Smith, our new secretary, she actually pointed out that she read an article that those who celebrate Christmas early are actually happier people. So, just so you know, if you're not excited about Christmas yet, you might be a Grinch. No, I'm kidding. I'm kidding. You're not. But anyway, so when I was thinking about this season, this holiday season as we come into, I was remembering a Christmas movie that I watched many years ago. How many people like the Hallmark Channel? You like the Christmas movies around Hallmark? Well, this movie was not on Hallmark, and it will never be on Hallmark. In fact, this is a movie that maybe would have fit in better with yesterday than today and moving forward. Have you ever heard of the movie Gremlins? You guys remember the movie Gremlins? You know, so this right here is a Mogwai, and his name was Gizmo. And in this movie, this young man was given this. It wasn't a doll, it was a pet. It was some sort of a creature called a Mogwai, and he named him Gizmo. And when he was given this creature, his dad told him, look, you have to follow 3 specific rules with this creature. 1, keep him out of the light. Don't let him get in bright lights, and don't let him get in sunlight. 2, don't let him get wet with water. Never give him water to drink. Never bathe him. And 3, don't ever let him eat after midnight. So what happens in this movie? You already know what's going to happen, right? This kid is going to break the rules. So this guy, he doesn't pay attention, and somehow or other, between him and a friend, they get some water on little Gizmo. And so what Gizmo does is they get 5 drops of water, and he drops 5 little balls of whatever, fur, that come out of him somehow. And those little balls of fur bloom the next day, and they end up being some more creatures that look, no, not yet. Not yet. They end up being some more creatures that look very similar to him. But their character is off. I mean, they are just terrible. Where Gizmo's a sweet little kind little pet, you know, he's kind of shy and he's afraid of things. The other creatures that came from him after the rules were broken, they were these fuzzy little troublemakers. You know, their attitudes were bad. They didn't listen to anything. And so what happened is they were given food after midnight. And when they were given food after midnight, which was one of the 3 rules, they turned into gremlins. Go ahead, next slide. And that's what they looked like. So they went from that cute little fuzzy Mogwai to a gremlin. And these things were a destructive terror in the movie. I mean, they just went all over the place, and they continued to reproduce until they took over the whole town. And so there was one little tiny cute creature, and then there were a bunch of destructive gremlins all over the place. Well, I was thinking about this movie because I was looking at 2 Kings 17. And as I was thinking about 2 Kings 17, we see some different things that happened. But we have to go all the way back to 1 Kings chapter 3, verse 2. And don't worry, I'm going to make the connection here. If you remember in our last series in 1 Kings, in chapter 3, verse 2, you've got King Solomon is made king. And in verse 2, it says that when the kingdom of Israel was still united under Solomon, the people, however, were still sacrificing at the high places because the temple had not yet been built for the name of the Lord. You see, the author kind of gave us some foreshadowing and gave us a clue, an indication that there were some rules that were being broken. Gave us an indication that there was something so small and tiny it seemed to be that was still going on in this nation, and we knew it was going to get bad. And it's the same thing here with this movie and the Gremlins, as they start out cute like a mogwai, right? It starts out, the desires in our life, they start out cute like a mogwai. God says, look, this is a good thing for you. It's good to eat. It's good to sleep. It's good to work. It's good to laugh. But God also says, but those desires, those actions, they can be twisted. And so it may not be good to eat if you're overeating. It may not be good to sleep if you're being lazy all the time and sleeping through your life. It may not be good to laugh if your laughter is a result of making fun of someone else. You see what's happening here? These are good things that God made for us, good desires, good creatures, that if we just twist and we allow our sin to get in and mix things up, then our perspective changes, and these good things, these good desires, they go bad. It starts that way in our life, as something small and cute, and it becomes something bad, and it gets out of hand and uncontrollable. And the problem with that sin, and sin is anything that you do or think or a way that you act in any way that is against what God commands, against what God expects, against God's standards. The reality is when you allow that small, that cute, that little desire, that little sin to continue to go unchecked, it will snowball and it'll be crazy and you can't put it back in the box. Consequences of unchecked sin are real. They're a reality in each of our life. Now, I don't want you to be in here today and kind of like remove yourself from the situation, okay? I don't want you to say, well, yeah, sin, and I get it, but I'm not struggling with any of the big ones. I haven't killed anybody. I haven't, raped anybody. I haven't beat anyone. Well, God says that all sin is sin. And God hates every bit of it. He hates every bit of sin that I commit in my life, even if I don't do what we call the big ones. And we have to remember that. So I want you to be real with yourself today. I want you to be real with how you see yourself. And I want you to remember something, that whenever you look at a situation and you go in a direction that is away from God, every step you take in a direction of something else is a step away from God. Every time you reach out and you grab something that you know God doesn't want you to grab, when you grab that fruit off the tree and He says you're not supposed to touch it, it's a step away from God. It's a step of saying, look, I know better than God for my life. And you see, this is what happens here with these people in Israel. Call it what you may, but it's clear that the Israelites allowed their desires to trump God's desire for them. You say, well, what are you talking about? Remember, in 1 Kings 3, it says the people, however, were still sacrificing at the high places. Well, see, here was the problem. God said, get rid of those high places. But they said, we don't have a temple. We don't have a place to worship you, God, so we're going to worship you in these places where pagans worship, and we're going to set up our worship to you in these little places. And so God said worship is good, and it's only good when you worship the one true God, Yahweh, in His ways and on His terms. Israel said, yes, worship's good. But we want to worship our way. Maybe they weren't quite as blatant to begin with. Maybe it was more subtle. Like something, maybe they said to themselves, we know you want us to be solely devoted to you, Lord. But if we do that, then we're going to miss out on this thing over here. God, I know you want us to be solely devoted to you, but if I devote every single area of my life to you, then I don't get to take part in that relationship that I want so badly. God, I know you want us to be devoted to you, but I'm going to have to stop doing what you've told me to stop doing, and I don't want to yet. You see, this was Israel's pattern. This is what they did. God said, look, love me, follow me, obey what I command, and things are going to go great. But he said, but if you disregard and you disobey, then things are going to go downhill, and it's going to be problematic for you in the future, even in your life now. And so what Israel did was they questioned God's goodness. They questioned if God wanted what was best for them, and so they went looking out of bounds for what they believed was the best for them. They put their desires above God's desires, their desires for happiness, their desires for worship, their desire for relationship, for love, for peace, for joy, for contentment. The way that they wanted to do it, they did it their way. And see, this struck me as I'm reading, as I'm looking back all the way from 1 Kings and in the 2 Kings so far, and all these people, so many of them that failed, it was all based in that. It was what was their desire. They wanted to follow their own desires, and instead of following what God did, God says, and I looked at that in my own life, and I say, God, where am I following myself? Where am I moving towards something else, and in the process moving away from you? And these are some of the things that we have to look at. You see, just like in that movie, The Gremlins, when just a few drips of water were dropped on the cute little mogwai, it grew into something that it never should have been. The same thing happens in our own lives, that when we just take a little bit of the world's water and we drip it on ourselves, on our desires, then sin comes forth. And those desires, they're slightly shifted, and they feed into our desires after midnight, and they change to a monstrosity, a destructive force in our own lives. Who's seen the destructive force of sin in your life? I have. I've seen it in my own life. Who's seen it in your own life? You've seen what happens when you allow that sin to grow and fester unchecked, when you disregard what God says. It may be fun for a season, but man, it hurts later on, doesn't it? And it not only harms us, but it harms other people. Well, so for Israel, they were a nation that continually moved away from God. They said, God, look, I hear what you're saying, but I don't really care. But we see something in 2 Kings chapter 17, that time is up. You see, God is patient, but he's also just. Don't miss this. God is a patient God. When it comes to our sin, he's patient. Man, he'll at times give us a lot of rope. Continue to walk in that sin, because his desire is like, look, son, you got to come back to me. Child, you've got to come back. You see, he's patient, but he's also just, and there's a limit to what he'll allow as he extends his grace and his mercy in the hope that you'll return. Disobeying God's expectations is a recipe for disaster. This is kind of what we see in this passage today. Disobeying God's expectations is a recipe for disaster. Well, let's read here the first 6 verses of 2 Kings 17. Okay, so it says, in the 12th year of Ahaz, king of Judah, Hoshea, son of Elah, became king of Israel in Samaria, and he reigned 9 years. Okay, so Samaria, we may be familiar with the term. Samaria was the capital city of northern Israel. Remember, Israel was divided, right? The 12 tribes of Israel were divided and split up into 2. And so 10 tribes in the north were all controlled by northern Israel, and its capital was in Samaria. And then Judah in the south, with part of the tribe of Benjamin, was in control down there. And so here, when it talks about the king of the northern kingdom, he was in Israel, he was located in Samaria. And in verse 2 says, he did evil in the eyes of the Lord. Now, so many passages, if you read through 1 Kings and 2 Kings, and God, through the writer, he talks about these kings. he'll say things like this. He'll say, this king was a good king because he followed and obeyed God, but this king was a bad king because he did evil in the eyes of the Lord. And it says in verse 2, he did evil in the eyes of the Lord, but not like the kings of Israel who preceded him. Okay. This is really important. This king Hoshea, he takes over in the capital city. And he disobeys God, but not as bad as the guys before him disobeyed. You know, see, the guys before him were constantly setting up these pagan places for false god worship. And they were doing crazy, child sacrifice and all sorts of things that God said not to do. And they were promoting it, and they were building temples to this stuff. But when it came to Hoshea, he didn't actually promote it. He didn't build anything new. He just didn't stop it. So he did evil in the eyes of the Lord, but he didn't quite go as far as the other kings before him. Don't miss this, because here's the thing. When we look at the people around us and we say, hey, I'm a good person because I may do wrong things, but I don't do the bad things that person does. I'm telling you, there are still consequences for our sin, even when we compare it to the sins of others, because the problem is the standard is not those around us. The standard is Jesus Christ, who lived a perfect, holy life and did not sin. Okay, so let's get back to this passage here. 1 Corinthians, where did I say that from? 2 Kings 17, verse 3. It says, Shalmaneser, king of Assyria, came up to attack Hoshea, who had been Shalmaneser's vassal and had paid him tribute. But the king of Assyria discovered that Hoshea was a traitor, for he had sent envoys to So, king of Egypt. And he no longer paid tribute to the king of Assyria as he had done year by year. Therefore, Shalmaneser seized him and put him in prison. Okay, so we see this here, that this Shalmaneser guy, this Assyrian, remember Jonah and the Ninevites he was supposed to go preach to? The Ninevites were Assyrians. Okay, so they were very bad people. They absolutely hated God, and they did what they wanted, and they worshipped a million different false gods. So this king of this place called Assyria, he comes up to attack northern Israel, Hoshea being the king. But the reason he's upset with him is because it says that Hoshea stopped paying tribute to him. Here's the thing. Assyria was kind of in control of northern Israel at this time. They'd won some battles. You see, Israel had allowed them to come in and do some things. And so what happened is they were constantly kind of paying a tax. Northern Israel was paying a tax. They were paying them, okay, we're going to keep giving you this like the big bully on the block, we're going to give you the money so you quit beating us up. But what happened is there was a change in leadership over in Assyria. And the person who was there before, they're gone. And now this person named Shalmaneser takes over. And so in that process, Hoshea looks and says, oh man, here's my opportunity. I don't want to pay this tribute anymore. I don't want to be under the thumb of the Assyrians. And so in the midst of that regime change, he goes down to Egypt, who's kind of another superpower at the time, and he tries to get help from the Egyptians to support his cause against Assyria. And so what happens is Shalmaneser, the king of Assyria, looks and says, oh, no, you're not going to do this. And so he goes on the attack. And so what happens here? It says in verse 5, the king of Assyria invaded the entire land, and he marched against Samaria, and he laid siege to it for 3 years. So 6 years into Hoshea's rule, this king comes in and he attacks the country for 3 years. In the 9th year of Hoshea, the king of Assyria captured Samaria and deported the Israelites to Syria. He settled them in various places, Halah and Gozan on the Habor River, and in towns of the Medes. Okay, so here's what happens. He comes in, the king of Assyria comes in, he says, you're not paying me anymore, and I don't like it, and so what I'm going to do is I'm going to take everything over. And so he grabs King Hoshea, the king of northern Israel, and he throws him in prison. And then we see something absolutely amazing, strange, and sad happen. As he invades this place, he grabs the important people. He grabs a bunch of the people from northern Israel, and he ships them off to Assyria, back to his own homeland. and he sits them right there in front of him so that he can keep them in control. But he doesn't stop there, because later on we read in the 30s here in 17 that what he also does is he sends his own Assyrian people into northern Israel. And so he mixes up the populations entirely. And see what happens when you bring in... Okay, so what happens when you bring in someone who doesn't love God into a situation where the people act like they love God, but they don't really love him either? Where does the allegiance of the people in the homeland go? They shift. They start to move. And see, this is what happens here in this time. And it's a really sad situation, because what God does here in this moment is he allows his people in northern Israel to be taken into exile. And everything gets all mixed up. Have you ever heard the story of the Good Samaritan? Raise your hands. Good Samaritan. Okay, you remember the story of how there was a Samaritan who was hurt. I mean, there wasn't a Samaritan. There was a Jew who was hurt on the side of the road. He got beat up, and then a Samaritan is the one that comes to fix him and help him be better. Well, what that story kind of shows is that during the time in the New Testament, the Samaritans and Israel, or Judah, they were against each other, and the people of Judah didn't like the Samaritans because the people of Judah were pure Jews, but the people of Samaria were mixed. They were not only mixed ethnically, but they were also mixed spiritually. They didn't just follow a God alone. They followed God and Baal and all these different things across the board. And this all happened because of this situation in 2 Kings 17. All these years before, this is how we get to that place where they're enemies. Okay, so I just wanted you to see this here. This is the what happened. And this is the author. He says, hey, I want you to see what happened in this time. And he says, hey, some really bad things happened. God's people got shipped out. Now, it's really easy to look at this story and see the what happened. And whenever we see situations like this, when we look at our own life, we say, God, I see what happened. I myself have been shipped into exile. I myself have been compromised. My life is a mess right now, God. I can't hold a relationship. God, my life is so problematic right now that people don't seem to like me and want to be around me. God, my family is a mess. Fill in the blank. The problem is we can't stop at the what happened. We have to ask the question, why did this happen? Why is it happening? And that's what I really want to get into today as we look at this. So we see here that the what happened is a pretty bad thing. I'll explain it like this so you can kind of understand. Do you guys remember the market crash of 2008? Okay, so I don't want to botch this up and mix it up, but for simple terms, we'll say it like this. That for years and years and years, people wanted to buy homes. And so these lenders would allow people who couldn't actually qualify to buy the homes, they would allow them to buy homes even though they couldn't afford the payment. And so what happened is they're giving out these cheap mortgages across the board to people who couldn't pay it, and then at the same time, the housing prices were going up. And so people that had no business buying these houses were getting them, and then they were defaulting on their loans. And then what was happening is the big banks on the outside, they were looking and they were saying, hey, I want to take out, I want to take control of this situation and make some money. And so they were essentially buying the mortgages at a cheaper price. Well, long story short, all of these things started to happen. These people, so many people were overwhelmed with their things, and it caused the stock market to crash. Now, that was a very basic view of this situation, because I'm not going to get into it like too much detail. But what it does, it was a mess, and the cause started out very small. And so people that were big business, making a lot of money, these huge companies, they were billionaire companies. They were living the high life until the crash. They kept making these little decisions that looked like they were at a pinnacle. But what they didn't see coming was the crash or the big short. You know what I mean? And so when everything crashed down, they were left penniless and companies were shut down. Some people went to jail. People were out of their homes. All of these consequences because of some stupid decisions in the beginning. And this was Israel's same situation. That's them right now. They were at the top and now they're crashing down to earth. And the problem was this was an avoidable debacle. They could have completely avoided it. All they needed to do was turn to God alone and worship Him alone, but they decided not to. And so God's tool was a country named Assyria to bring His people back to Him. And He brought His people back to Him by sending them away. You know, we look at the why. We want to understand the why, and we'll explain it here. I'm just going to read through the rest of this. This is going to be a long chunk, but 2 Kings 17, verse 7 through 23. This is the why Israel was exiled, because of their sin. All this took place because the Israelites had sinned against the Lord their God, who had brought them up out of Egypt from under the power of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. Do you see that? Do you see that right there? It says God did this. These people got taken over because they sinned against God. And in the next breath, the writer says, the same God who'd rescued them from slavery once before. The same God who'd taken them out of their terrible situation and had pointed them to the promised land. The same God that said, follow me and you're going to be blessed. The writer makes sure to point this out. He says, look at these people. They had a history of being rescued from situations that their sin had gotten them into. But they didn't remember it. They forgot their true love, their first love in God. It says, so they were under the power of Pharaoh, the God who rescued them from under the power of Pharaoh of Egypt. And it says they worshipped other gods. And they followed the practices of the nations the Lord had driven out before them, as well as the practices that the kings of Israel had introduced. Man, this is crazy. There's so much being said here. And for you this morning sitting here, the first time I read, I just glossed over it. I thought this is very basic, of course. They didn't obey God and they worshiped other gods. But God put it in there. He put those words in there. He said, they didn't want me, who can give them everything that they need. They didn't want me, who knows what's best for them. And what did they do instead? They worshipped other gods. They worshipped other things. They couldn't provide for them in the way that I can. They couldn't provide for them anything. See, the nation of Israel had given in to sin. They'd given in to idolatry. They'd given in to false gods. Well, let's continue reading. And at the end of verse 7, it says, they worshipped other gods. In verse 8, and they followed the practices of the nations the Lord had driven them out before them, as well as the practices that the kings of Israel had introduced. I mean, that's just terrible. It's bad enough they were following what the people around them, the cultures around them, what the world was saying to do and follow. And on top of that, their own leaders were driving them in the wrong direction, were stepping them constantly and continually away from God. In verse 9, this is scary. This is a scary sentence. It says, the Israelites secretly did things against the Lord their God that were not right. I mean, who were they trying to fool? Secretly. Is there anything that we can do in secret that God can't see? Is there anything? They did things against the Lord their God that were not right. From watchtower to fortified city, they built themselves high places in all their towns. You see, they'd allowed the pagan religions to come in and permeate every single bit of their being. Entire city, all the way left and right, every single avenue, every single place. They'd allow this false gods to move in. They set up sacred stones and Asherah poles on every high hill and under every spreading tree. At every high place they burned incense, as the nations whom the Lord had driven out before them had done. They did wicked things that aroused the Lord's anger. They worshipped idols, though the Lord had said, "You shall not do this." The Lord warned Israel and Judah through all his prophets and seers. He said, "Turn from your evil ways, observe my commands and decrees, in accordance with the entire law that I commanded your ancestors to obey, and that I delivered to you through my servants, the prophets." And verse 14 is a sad verse. It says, "But they would not listen, and they were just as stiff-necked as their ancestors who did not trust in the Lord their God." This is the indictment. The writer says, do you want to know why we're in exile right now? Do you want to know why this happened? Do you want to know why your lives fell apart, why your nations fell apart? Do you want to know why you couldn't hold on to relationships? Because you disobeyed God, because you decided to go in every direction but His. It's a sad situation. It's a sad place. And we have to learn from their mistakes, right? We have to learn from looking in the Bible. This is, okay, I so often read the Bible when I was younger, and even now to this day, and I read it, and I place the people like arm's length, like they're just not me. They're Bible stories. They're people, they're places that I've never been to and I can't even touch. And so there's something in my head that says it's real, but it's not really real for me. But we've got to be careful that we don't take the reality of that situation and push it to the side and say, well, that's just history, because the truth is, it's reality. It's what happens today in each of our lives. We tend to push God to the side and take our own direction and our own steps all the time. And every step away from God every step in a direction away from God is obviously a step away from Him. And so what happens here? God, just as He'd driven the people out of the land, just as He's driven the pagans out of the promised land when He sent His people in, He now drove His own people out of the land because they were worshiping the pagan gods. And that last verse says, "But they wouldn't listen, and they were just as stiff-necked as their ancestors who didn't trust God." What happened to the stiff-necked ancestors, the ones who kind of stood firmly and in defiance of what God said? God said, "Look, I'm warning you, I'm warning you, I'm warning you. You got to stop, you got to stop, you got to stop, you got to follow, you got to follow." And they just stood up. I'm not going to listen. I'm going to keep doing my thing. And so what happened? Some of them were killed. Some of them were sent into wandering for years on end, 40 years. Some of them didn't even get to see the promised land that they were headed toward. God said, "Follow me, and you're going to get to go to this awesome place." And they said, "Okay, but we're going to follow you our way." And He said, "Guess what? You don't get to go there now." There are plans that He's got for our lives, and He just wants us to follow and walk in His ways. Not be distracted by the left and the right. But in order to get into that blessing, we've got to continue following Him. And for every time we veer off, we're missing what He's actually got for our life. I'm not saying we can't be redeemed and brought back to a place where He's got things for us, but we can't continually walk away. And so as we look at Israel's fall, we've got to look at our own lives and ask the question, do I worship other gods? Am I guilty of idol worship? You know, Jared C. Wilson, if you bring up the quote here, he said this. He said, "All sin is idolatry, because every sin is an exercise in trust of something or someone other than the one true God to satisfy, fulfill, or bless." All sin is idolatry. Every time we choose something else over God, we're saying, "I trust this thing, I trust myself over Him. I want to be satisfied in this thing myself over God. I want to find fulfillment and blessing in something other than God." And we act just like the Israelites. And we see their mighty fall here. And here's what we've got to do. We've got to be willing to look at our own hearts and ask the question, do I have any idols? I want you to take a minute right now and ask yourself, do I have any idols? Do I follow God 100%? Or do I follow him 90% and then 10% keep back for myself? If we're not all in, then we're all out. We got to be all in for God. And we've got to be careful that we don't have any idols in our lives, and we've got to look at those things. There was a story of a man who went camping next to a 60-foot cliff one night. And what happened is he got up in the middle of the night and he stepped right off the cliff. And he was injured. Now, amazingly, the guy didn't die. But when they asked what happened, hey, why did you walk right off the cliff in the middle of the night? He said, I was sleepwalking. Have you ever had those dreams where you're falling and then you wake yourself and then you wake up? See, this guy had a dream that he was falling and he woke up and he really had fallen. And here's the problem. He put his tent up right near the cliff. Right next to the cliff. He put his tent up right in the danger zone. Friends, I got to tell you, it's hard enough to not fall off the cliff when you're looking at it and leaning over it, much less sleepwalking right over it. You see, we have to look at our lives and say, where are the idols in my life? Where are the sins in my life? What are the things that I'm getting close to that are going to cause me to walk off the cliff? Where are the high places that I continue to worship that are going to cause me to walk off the cliff the second that I'm not paying attention? Because here's the thing, friends, Satan is a good magician. You see, he looks at you and he holds his hand out to you this way and says, here, watch my hand and watch what I can do with these cards. All at the same time, he's just distracting you from taking your watch with his other hand. You see, Satan, he'll dangle something out there and deceive you. And he'll say, look, this is a good thing. Put your tent right there. Get a nice view. And you get distracted by the view, and you get distracted by the things in your life that are coming around that feel good and taste good and sound good and make you excited when they're not from God, and then you fall off a cliff. You see, we've got to be careful. We've got to look and say, what are the idols in my own life? We've got to be watchful. Don't set up your camp next to the danger zone. You'll continue to step in a direction that God doesn't want. Okay, so one of the things that Wilson says, you know, in that quote, following the quote, he comes back and he says, look, here's the remedy. If we're struggling with idol worship in our life, and we all do, we all struggle with some sort of idol worship, then we've got to do something to combat that. We've got to proclaim Jesus at every turn. Every moment we've got to be preaching the gospel to ourselves and reminding us of who he is and what he did for us. Every time we're left with a decision of, do I choose God or do I not choose God? We've got to remember the gospel that Jesus died for us, that he died for our sin, and that he knows what's best for us. And as we remember that, what he died for, he suffered on the cross for that very sin, for that choice that should we make it to sin, he suffered for that thing that we're going to do. We've got to preach the gospel to ourselves on a daily basis. Well, let's continue to read here kind of through the rest of this, verse 15 and on. It says here, they rejected his decrees and the covenant he had made with their ancestors and the statutes he had warned them to keep. They followed worthless idols and themselves became worthless. They imitated the nations around them, although the Lord had ordered them, do not do as they do. They followed worthless idols and themselves became worthless. God says, look, they wasted their time. They wasted their talents. They decided to follow something and someone that wasn't me, and that's not what's best for their life. And so because of that, they became worthless. I couldn't do anything with them. I couldn't reach people with them. No longer was Israel a beaming beacon of light that said, hey, look at our God because he's absolutely amazing. And God said, look, you're kind of worthless now, so I got to send you away because you're messing it up. All right, let's continue here. It says, verse 16, they forsook all the commands of the Lord their God and made for themselves 2 idols cast in the shape of calves and an Asherah pole. They bowed down to all the starry hosts and they worshiped Baal. They sacrificed their sons and daughters in the fire. They practiced divination and sought omens and sold themselves to do evil in the eyes of the Lord, arousing his anger. And so verse 18, it says, so the Lord was very angry with Israel, and he removed them from his presence. Only the tribe of Judah was left. I read that and thought to myself, I wonder if I have done anything. I wonder what I have done that the Lord was very angry at me for. I don't know. I mean, I can think of some things. But as I look at this passage, God was so angry with them because they broke the first commandment. Thou shalt have no other God before me. And I got to tell you that may be the first commandment, but the other 9 that follow basically explain and show what it looks like to have other gods before him if we break those too. And it's all idolatry. Let's continue to read here. It says, so the Lord was very angry with Israel, and he removed them from his presence, and only the tribe of Judah was left. It's like, look, okay, the northern kingdom was gone. They got pushed into exile. They wouldn't listen. And Judah's watching this whole thing play out in the south. You see, Judah had some good kings. They didn't have all good kings. The northern kingdom had no good kings. And so Judah's in the south, and it's watching, and it says there, only the tribe of Judah was left. And in verse 19, and even Judah did not keep the commands of the Lord their God. They followed the practices Israel had introduced. Therefore, the Lord rejected all the people of Israel. He afflicted them and gave them into the hands of plunderers until he thrust them from his presence. When he tore Israel away from the house of David, they made Jeroboam, son of Nebat, their king. Jeroboam enticed Israel away from the following the Lord and caused them to commit a great sin. Verse 22, the Israelites persisted in all the sins of Jeroboam and did not turn away from them. Where have we persisted in our sin and not turned away, thinking we're not going to get caught or have to face the consequences? They didn't turn away from their sins in verse 23 until the Lord removed them from his presence, as he had warned them through all his servants, the prophets. So the people of Israel were taken from their homeland into exile in Assyria, and they are still there as at the time of the writing. They persisted and continued to turn away from God. They didn't heed any of his warnings because they just didn't think it was important enough, and they didn't think they'd get caught. I don't know what it was, but I know what it is in my life. I continue to persist in sin. We continue to persist in sin because we don't see the consequences. Because we think, I got away with that last time. I can do it again. I got away with it the last 10 times. I can do it again. And so what happens is we desensitize ourselves to what God says is wrong, and we start to make it right because we justify, well, God hasn't punished me for it. I guess it's okay. Problem is, there are consequences for our sin. And here's the amazing thing, guys. We get to be here today. We get to look at a passage like this, and we get to, like Judah, get to see what happened to Israel. And we have the opportunity where God is looking at us right now, and He's calling into our hearts and our minds, and He's saying, look, wake up. Quit persisting in your sin. Quit persisting in whatever it is that you're doing there. Maybe it's a bad attitude. It's constantly being cynical. Maybe you're a defiant or a rebellious person. Maybe you struggle with lust. Maybe you struggle with, all sorts of, things. Maybe you're a slanderer. Maybe you talk about people. I don't know. I don't know what it is in your life. I know what the things are in my life, and I have to constantly be on my knees. And I have to be putting on the armor of God, Ephesians 6:10 and on. God, I got to pray because I need you to fight these things in me because I am struggling. But we can't allow ourselves to be desensitized because we don't see the consequences happening just yet, because God is a just God. And He's going to call one day. And He's going to say, your time's up. Where have I persisted? You know, we look at this passage and it's harsh. You know, Pastor Andrew, this is a rough one today. Anybody think this is a rough passage? It's not exciting, right? Who's reading this today going, yeah? No, it's hard to do that because the second we start cheering for what God did to Israel, we're starting to wait a minute. I don't want that to happen to me, though. Because what does exile look like in our lives? I don't know. I don't know what it'll look like for you or for me. But I do know that I better quit persisting in the things that God says not to do and start setting my mind on things above. I better quit setting my camp right next to the cliff. It's hard enough not to fall off when I'm paying attention, much less when I'm sleepwalking. So what now? What's the solution to all this? How can I be self-aware? We've got to ask ourselves some questions. What is your mogwai? What is that cute little creature in your life? What is that little desire? What is that thing that God says, hey, I put this in you because it's a good thing? He says, look, I want you to follow me. I want you to love me. This is in your life for a good reason. You know, I don't know what it is. Maybe it's sex. Married or unmarried, maybe you're not using it the right way. If you're unmarried, you're not supposed to be. But if you are, you're still supposed to treat your wives and your spouses like they're a gift from God. So maybe that's your mogwai. Maybe your mogwai is the desire for food. Maybe your mogwai is hey, I like to sleep a little bit. Well, maybe it's turning into laziness. I don't know, but we've got to remember, Israel had a good thing. They wanted to worship, they just didn't follow the rules. And they ended up living in destruction. Don't let what God made for good or your desire grow from a mogwai into a destructive creature called a gremlin. So ask yourself, what are my gremlins? And I know some of you may be laughing at that a little bit, but it's sad because that's what it can turn into. You know, they had 3 rules. They said, hey, don't get them wet. Don't give them water. Don't let them eat after midnight. But then there was another one, and it says, don't shine them with bright light and don't let them in the sunlight. Why not? Because if you put them in the sunlight, it will kill them. Friends, it's time to put our gremlins in the sunlight. It's time to expose ourselves. It's time to shine the light on our sin and kill it. And there's no better time than today. You know, so often we live in a life of next times. You know, next time I'm going to do this. Next time I'm going to do that. The problem is we've got to quit living for next time and start living for this time. And this time is right here, right now. We have an opportunity to say, God, what are my gremlins? What am I living with that I shouldn't be? What do I need to change in my life? And how do I fix it? Shine a light on it. God, I struggle with this right now. Please forgive me. I confess to you that this is wrong and I should never do it again. And allow God to kill it with His grace. You see, that's what happened at the cross. God exposed our sin, and He laid it on Jesus' body. And He killed it. And it was something we didn't deserve. He gave us the gift of life. He gave us the gift of forgiveness, and we didn't deserve it. And that's what grace is. And see, we've got to live in that. We've got to continually live, and we've got to remind ourselves what God did for us constantly. Every time that we have a choice to make, to say, hey, look, if I make this choice, God, show me what's going to happen. Well, sometimes He won't show you. Sometimes he won't say, hey, if you drop the water on it, that thing's going to turn into a gremlin. Sometimes he just says, don't do it. And we have to trust him at his word. Don't eat from the tree, and trust him at his word. Where do we need to trust God at his word and live in his grace? Expose your sin today and live in his grace. Let's pray. Dear God, we need you. We need you to expose our sinful nature. We need you to break down the walls of where we're not living for you. God, we need you to show us the direction that we're going. For every step that we're moving in the direction of something else, we're moving away from you. I pray that we would be on our knees and you would open the floodgates of your grace, and in your kindness lead us to repentance. God, we need you. We love you. We want to serve you and worship you. Empower us to do it with your Spirit, and take captive every thought that is not according to what you want in our lives. We pray these things in the wonderful, matchless name of Jesus Christ. Amen. All right, I trust you guys have a great week. Welcome to November, and we'll see you next week.